Class 5's Origins, written by Mr. John H. Thompson, narrated by Mark Isham. Class 5's Origins by John H. Thompson. Copyright 2011, John H. Thompson. All rights reserved. Dedication. This is for Avery, my editor. Chapter 1. Abilities. The black and white police cruiser slid slowly to a stop at the curb in front of the sprawling apartment building, directly opposite the glass front door. The driver, Sergeant Dan Sinsky, a 22-year veteran, looked over, his eyes automatically probing the gloom visible inside the structure for any movement. Seated beside him, Officer Jim Bells, just entering his 4th year as one of Los Angeles Police Department's finest, heaved a deep sigh and glanced down again at the paper on the clipboard in his lap. 1540 Kitteridge, he said flatly. Apartment 220. Dan nodded thoughtfully. It was yet another routine chore that had recently been dumped into the hands of the patrol forces. The direct result of yet another round of budgetary cutbacks by a bureaucracy finding itself squeezed for cash and deciding that the already meager resources available to serve and protect the good people of Los Angeles County could be trimmed just a little bit further. As a result, many of the standard, low-hazard information gathering duties once performed exclusively by specially trained plainclothes officers would be folded into the to-do lists of uniformed sector patrol personnel. In this case, it was a preliminary interview with a potential witness to a rather bizarre encounter at a liquor store the previous day that had resulted in one person sustaining a very nasty head wound and an incomprehensible explanation provided by the swarthy store clerk to whom English was most definitely a second, perhaps even third, language. According to the clerk, the alleged victim had been jumped by another customer the moment he had stepped through the front door of the shop and tackled to the floor by the rather slightly built man who clung to his back while shoving a hand into the space behind the victim's long windbreaker. The clerk had naturally begun bellowing rapidly in whatever his native gibberish was and bustled around the counter to try and pry them apart, or at least achieve a much closer position from which to shout down at the pair. But by the time he had cleared the end of the counter and stepped halfway to where they were sprawled, the attacker was pushing himself up, a palm pressed firmly into the back of the bigger man beneath him, and there was a large, dark, ugly-looking gun in his free hand. Naturally, the clerk had jerked to a halt, his tirade choked to a sudden silence, his body going rigid in panicked confusion and fear. Considering his line of work, he was not unfamiliar with seeing firearms in the store, and it never boded well for him or the contents of his employer's cash drawer. But then the attacker had done something amazingly bizarre. Raising the gun, which had turned out to be a rather impressive Smith & Wesson .38 Special, he had swung it hard, clipping it firmly across the back of the victim's head, causing the bigger man's form to instantly sag in an eerie stillness on the floor. Without even looking up, the attacker had carefully placed the pistol on the floor and given it a shove, skidding it across the dirty linoleum to the feet of the stunned clerk. Before the clerk could react, the attacker had thrown himself off the now unconscious man and scrambled to his feet, already shooting out a hand to shove open the door and flee into the parking lot. It had taken several seconds for the clerk to process this unusual chain of events and finally step over to the door just in time to catch the barest glimpse of the license plate of the car the attacker had scrambled into and memorize all but the last digit of the number before the vehicle had peeled out of the parking lot that ran along the length of the collection of stores in the long, low, single building and roar off down the street, disappearing into traffic. After listening to his rather confused explanation of the events, Sergeant Sinsky had called in the sketchy facts and run a routine check on the identity of the victim, obtained from his wallet just before the EMTs had loaded him onto the stretcher. He was a bit surprised to be informed a few moments later that this victim was in fact on parole after having served a 5-year stretch in Folsom Penitentiary for, of all things, robbing a liquor store. Apparently it hadn't been his first time. He had, at the time of his prior arrest, already been a suspect in a half a dozen more such crimes. Returning to the precinct to begin the grueling round of endless paperwork such events always generated, Sinsky had been informed that the weapon, which had put the rather unpleasant minor dent in the now only alleged victim's skull, was in fact registered to that same alleged victim's cousin. The fact that the clerk had scooped the gun off the floor, turning it over in his hands as he stared at it in trembling disbelief, had rendered any fingerprint evidence utterly useless. When Sinsky had been provided with the list of owners' names and addresses for all vehicles whose license plate numbers matched the known digits of the attacker's plates, the lieutenant had informed Dan and his partner it would be their responsibility to check them out, see if they could match the clerk's somewhat vague physical description of the attacker to any of the owners when interviewed in person. There were, thankfully, only 5 possibilities on the list as, for some unknown reason, no letters and no odd numbers had been used for that final missing digit on any plates bearing the rest of the already known sequence. Even more strange was the fact that 4 of the 5 possible plates had been issued to residents of Los Angeles County, the 5th going to someone residing in Sacramento. This was stop number 4 for the pair of now thoroughly bored officers. The other 3 had wound up belonging to, in turn, an ancient Asian man who hadn't driven his vehicle for over a month, a pleasingly attractive black woman who had just returned from a lengthy trip, and one of a small fleet of sedans owned by a carpet cleaning company, none of which had been off the company lot in the past week. Dan sighed, having assessed what he could see of the dimly lit lobby beyond the glass doors across the street from where their black and white was parked, and judged it normal and containing not the least threat of any kind. He reached for the door handle. "Let's go," he said. It took only a few moments for the apartment manager, seated in his office with a view across the lobby to the front door, to bustle out from behind his desk and usher the 2 policemen into the building. A brief exchange of their need to talk to one of the tenants led to their moving down the second-story hallway within a minute of having first knocked on the building's front door. The apartment manager nervously pointed out the door to the apartment in question, and when Dan simply nodded and then stared at him, the manager silently took a couple steps back, giving the 2 police officers a bit more space. Dan turned and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door was pulled open, and Dan found himself facing a man of average height, a bit on the thin side with a disorderly mop of light sandy hair, ordinary features, and a pair of wide, startled eyes. Yeah?" the man said after a few seconds. "Mr. Kleinschmidt? John Kleinschmidt?" Dan asked, his tone quiet and unthreatening. Yeah. What's—" the man responded, his brows furrowing down slightly. "Mr. Kleinschmidt, we'd like to ask you a few questions, if that's okay." John hesitated for only a moment before giving a sharp nod and stepping back, opening the entrance to the narrow passage from the building hallway into his own small single-room apartment. "Come on in," he said, his voice suddenly a bit falsely bright. "Make yourselves comfy. I just have to take a leak. Sit down. Be right back." As he said this, he had turned and begun moving toward the door tucked in the corner next to the small kitchen area. Instantly, Dan's senses crackled. Something in the man's tone wasn't quite right, and he'd been in enough situations that had gone south with unexpected suddenness to know that the only way to be sure some seemingly innocent individual wouldn't suddenly whirl around pointing a handful of weapon at him was to get them seated a few feet away and preferably with their hands zip-cuffed behind their backs. "Wait, Mr. Kleinschmidt," he began, stepping forward to where John was already moving toward the half-open door, one hand reaching out to grab his shoulder if necessary, the other raising to rest on the butt of his holstered 9mm. Just in case. Then the man was bolting toward the door, and Dan reacted totally on 20-plus years of instinct, his thumb flicking the snap on the small strap that held his Glock tightly in its holster, even as the fingers curled around the butt of the pistol and began drawing it free. But he also knew there was no way in hell he would ever actually fire the weapon in this place unless the suspect literally pointed the business end of a firearm at him. These cheap apartment walls were not thick enough to prevent his own high-powered bullet from punching into the room beyond the surface that divided that adjacent space from this one, and probably through the wall on the opposite side of that enclosure as well, hitting God knew what along the way. All he could reasonably hope to do would be to aim directly at the guy's face and, maybe, for an extra attention-getter, cock the hammer. Beyond that, unless this guy was unquestionably about to kill him, Dan was setting up nothing more than a 6-pound, impressive-looking bluff. The man hit the half-open door with an extended arm and plunged into the gloom beyond. The bang of the door bouncing off the wall in the dark space instantly confirmed that the room must indeed be a bathroom, small, tight, and essentially hollow. As his body passed beyond the threshold, the man was already whirling, slapping at the door to send it back, already closing off the smaller space. It had barely slammed closed with a sharp thud when Dan reached it, not bothering to attempt grabbing and turn the knob, but leaning his shoulder into his forward movement, hoping to burst the weak seal of the bolt and, with luck, slam into the guy himself and send him sprawling before he could manage to grab anything he might have hidden within the smaller room. Dan tensed his body as his shoulder rammed the door, which flew open out of the way of his bulk, and gave one extra lunge with his feet into the dark space. But all he encountered was the cool air inside the empty room, and before he could pull back, John Kleinschmidt opened his eyes to find himself standing before the sink in the small dark bathroom. How long had he gone, he wondered. Was it long enough? He couldn't worry about that now, he told himself, reaching to yank open the bathroom door and hurrying through into the small kitchenette, snatching up his car keys that sat atop the microwave oven, whirling and moving toward the apartment's front door. In seconds, he was in the hallway, pausing only long enough to jam the key into the lock and give it a swift turn before yanking it free and moving briskly into the stairwell. A quarter-minute later, he was striding across the small lobby toward the door that led to the ground-level parking area and beyond. Within a minute of opening his eyes in the bathroom, he was sliding behind the driver's seat of his small sedan and cranking the engine to life while he pushed the button on the small device clipped to the visor, which caused the heavy iron gate to begin rumbling along its track, opening the portal to the street beyond. Before the gate had reached its fully open position, he was nosing up the slight ramp, pausing to scan down the street and then slipping into the traffic lane and accelerating toward the corner 100 yards ahead. He stopped, allowing the rather heavy flow of traffic on the wide, multi-lane cross street to clear, and then turned right, pushing on the gas, gathering speed. In seconds, he was lost in the collection of moving vehicles and out of sight of the building. 30 seconds later, the black and white police cruiser turned the corner at the far end of the quiet street and glided along it, like a predator aware of the effect its appearance would have and enjoying a sense of power. It rolled in front of the long, wide apartment building and slid slowly to a stop directly across the street from the glass front door of the structure. Sergeant Dan Sinsky, a 22-year veteran of the LAPD, looked over, his eyes automatically probing the gloom visible inside the structure for any movement. Beside him in the passenger seat, Officer Jim Bells, in his 4th year as a Los Angeles police officer, looked down at the paper attached to the clipboard on his lap. 1540 Kitteridge, apartment 220, he said almost mechanically. Dan nodded thoughtfully, lost for a moment in his own musings, then sighed. Let's go, he said, reaching for the door handle. He dug in his pocket, letting his fingers identify the quarter and pulled it out, placing it on the counter before him. The clerk nodded absently, scooped it up and dropped it into the open register drawer. Roger Malloy sighed, took the newspaper off the counter and moved through the door into the parking lot of the convenience store, gazing down to scan the headlines. It was some typical rubbish about some political scandal or other, just one more of the amazing collection of banalities that constituted the endless grind that was modern life. Christ, he thought, why are people so goddamn stupid? A little ripple of annoyance flitted through his chest and he snapped the paper double, glancing up as he stepped off the curb into the parking lot. When he looked over to where his car was parked, he jerked to a halt. The large delivery truck that had followed him into the lot was now parked, its wide tail end standing fully open, a long metal ramp extending down from it to the asphalt, and the heavy-set man in the light blue coveralls was just maneuvering the oversized dolly loaded with boxes down it, and it was parked directly in front of Roger's car, totally blocking him. Damn it, he thought, and moved toward where the delivery man was now turning to tip the dolly and start across toward the convenience store. Hey, Roger called, you're blocking me in. The man glanced at him, his face tight and unfriendly. Yeah, well, I gotta make this delivery, he said, gruffly turning and starting to draw the heavily laden dolly along behind him. Oh, yeah? And how long is that going to take? Roger snapped back, now standing at the rear corner of the truck. As long as it takes, the delivery man said, and there was a smirk somewhere in his tone. He pulled the dolly to the edge of the walkway in front of the convenience store and managed to haul it up over the curb with a grunt. Roger stood fuming, his anger growing. Okay, he told himself, just call the police. Just take out your cell and call the cops. But then he remembered that the start time of the movie was less than a half hour from now, and he still had to get parked and get his ticket, and this bastard goes and blocks him in. No, he thought firmly, just call the cops. That's all. It's not worth it. He watched, fuming, as the delivery man managed to swing the door open and glide the dolly into the store, then ease it upright, centering its heavy load. And then he turned, looking out the glass door directly at where Roger stood, and for a moment Roger thought he could see the guy smile. Then, to Roger's surprise, the delivery man moved over to the counter, turned to lean his hip against it, cross his arms, and simply stare out at where Roger was rooted, his anger now boiling up to full. Fuck it, Roger thought, turned and moved briskly along the length of the large vehicle. He didn't even hesitate as he rounded the front of the truck, shifting the folded newspaper to his right hand, then leaned down to take a firm grip under the truck's front bumper with the other. I really shouldn't be doing this, he managed to tell himself, before he straightened upright, the truck emitting a squeaky metallic groan as its front wheels lifted from the surface. Too late now, he thought, and took a step. The locked pairs of tires instantly roared quietly with a grating, skidding sound as they scraped across the asphalt of the lot, and the dangling ramp at the rear of the truck jangled, bumping on the surface. Roger took a dozen steps, enough to make sure that access to his car was clear, then simply released the bumper. The cab banged down loudly, the sound dying away to quiet squeaks of offended joints. Roger stepped back around the side of the truck, his eyes searching out the front door of the convenience store. He spotted the delivery man now standing in front of the counter, his body upright, rigid, and unmoving. As he reached the rear of the truck and moved along the side of the ramp, Roger stopped, glancing down at it before returning his attention to where the delivery man stood rooted inside the store. What the hell, he thought. He raised a foot, placed it on the edge of the ramp, and shoved down. Like a piece of aluminum foil, the ramp bent sharply with a loud, sudden squeal. Lifting his foot, Roger saw that the ramp was now almost L-shaped, one end still attached to the rear of the truck opening, the other end almost parallel to the ground for half its length. Have a nice day, asshole, Roger thought, continuing to stare at the man inside the store, and then smiled pleasantly. He climbed into his car, cranked up the engine, and pulled toward the entry of the parking lot. He didn't see that the delivery man was now frantically waving his arms at the confused and frightened clerk and demanding he call 911 immediately. I really shouldn't have done that, Roger thought. Oh well, guess I'm not going to be shopping here anymore. He turned into the road and pushed gently on the gas pedal. John Kleinschmidt glanced down at the speedometer, assuring himself that he was just within the speed limit, and ordered himself to relax, leaning back against the seat and raising a hand to wipe it over his face before propping his elbow on the sill of the open window. What do I do? He wondered nervously. What do I do? He hadn't thought to prepare for something like this, and he inwardly chided himself for his complacency. Just because everything had gone smoothly for so long now, he'd gotten careless and sloppy, and that made him not only angry at his own stupidity, but also immeasurably tired. You had to go and try to be a hero, he told himself. Had to stick your nose in where it didn't belong. Get your stupid ass involved in something that was none of your business, and look what happens. Okay, he ordered himself, calm down, think. One step at a time. First, he knew, would be to see if he could work out some kind of story that would explain that little adventure in that damned liquor store yesterday. Geez, he moaned internally. Why did I have to do that? Why didn't I just get out, walk away? But no, I had to stick my nose in, and now what, he suddenly wondered. Was he some kind of suspect? But suspected of what? Okay, so he'd smacked the dumb bastard with his own gun, maybe knocked him cold, but surely... A sudden wave of icy fear flowed over him. Had the guy died? Had he cracked his skull or something? He hadn't hit him that hard, had he? Just enough to knock him cold, that's all. Okay, he told himself, first thing. Get a newspaper, check for some kind of notice about it. Find out if the guy was really hurt bad or just wound up with a nasty headache. And he considered if the guy hadn't been hurt too bad, try to find a way to justify what he had done. He could say he'd caught sight of the guy walking up to the door, already reaching into his pants to position the gun. No, that wouldn't fly, he told himself. They'd ask him, what if the guy had been a plainclothes cop, or some kind of security guard? How could he know that in fact the guy was going to shove the gun in the clerk's face and demand all the cash in the register? How could he know that when the terrified clerk had hesitated a fraction of a second too long, that the guy would pump a bullet clean through his forehead? He knew, he reassured himself, because he'd seen it happen. Standing not 5 feet behind the gunman, feeling his own body spasm in shock at the noise of the shot, watching the body of the clerk crumple to the floor on the far side of the counter. Hell, he could still remember the taste of the gun smoke in his mouth. And if he hadn't managed to jump back as the guy finally sensed him standing there and was already turning, the gun swinging around toward him, he'd probably be dead himself right now. Okay, he thought. He could have jumped and simply walked away before it all went down, but how could he have done that, knowing that a man would die if he distanced himself from it? He'd had to do something. Catching the son of a bitch the instant he walked in the door was all he could think of, and all he had time to manage. But how would he explain that to the cops? Maybe, he considered, he could say he'd seen the guy drive up, park, pull out the gun, check it for ammo, then get out of the car, shoving it into his pants at his back. Isn't that what those types did on TV and in the movies? Wasn't that an unmistakable clue that a robbery, or perhaps worse, was about to go down? Or was that just movie bullshit? Christ, he thought bitterly, what a frickin' mess. And he was already planning to hit the track this weekend. Well, he supposed he could still do it, hopefully pick up some quick cash. Despite the tension of the current circumstances, he couldn't prevent himself from grinning slightly. Hitting the racetracks was, after all, what passed for his job. Yes, it was stupid and kind of a cheat, but it was what he did. And he really wasn't doing anything bad, wasn't stealing anything, not technically. After all, someone was going to win, right? All he did was make sure it happened to be him. And whom did that hurt? But he had long ago stopped dwelling on that aspect of things. I mean, he couldn't let himself be constantly responsible for everybody else, could he? He had to watch out for himself. Okay, he admitted, maybe he did cheat, just a little bit. But that wasn't stealing, and it really was the perfect application for his bizarre ability. He just had to use it carefully, not get carried away, that's all. Ever since he'd realized he had this thing, he'd wondered how he could make use of it. And it had finally hit him that time he'd headed down to Atlantic City from where he had been living in Hackensack, up at the grubbier end of the state of New Jersey. And it was simple. He would go to some racetrack, greyhounds, trotters, or thoroughbreds, it really didn't matter, and would wait until the running of the first race of the day. They were fast races, usually no more than a couple of minutes. Another minute to post the results. 3 minutes or so. If the payout was big enough or some long shot came in at big odds, he would find a quiet corner, jump back, and then make his bets. In a way, it was like fishing by knowing exactly where the fish were going to be at exactly the moment the hook dropped into the water above them. You couldn't miss. The only thing he had to be careful about was that doing too many jumps too quickly caused him mind-numbing headaches. One time he had capitalized on 5 unexpected long shots in an 8-race card, and by the time he collected the last of his winnings, he felt like he would throw up the whole way home. That was when he made his first mistake. Up until that point, he had been careful, always betting moderately, pocketing the majority of his win from each race and only making a limited bet on the next, so that at the end of the day, the 10 or 20,000 he'd won had been spread out over numerous races and would go undetected on anyone's cheating radar. And as long as he rotated tracks on a regular basis, used different betting counters for each race, he was never memorable enough to even be noticed. But after that heavy day of jumping, he became more cautious about extending himself, so the next time he hit the track, he'd lucked into a massive long shot with the first race and decided to bet everything he'd brought with him. The result was almost 100,000. And suddenly he was having to fill out tax forms and getting his name and identity recorded, and he realized he could never return to this particular track. That was when he had begun his travels. Driving around the country, working his way through the dog tracks in Florida, the various trotter races in the Midwest, and now he had arrived here in California. He had intended to hit Hollywood Park and Santa Anita before moving on to Del Mar. He had been putting it off for some time now, and his remaining cash had dwindled considerably. He had just enough put by to make one big killing on a single race and then disappear for a couple of years. Maybe head out of the country and see what Europe had to offer in the way of pickings. And racing season was about to end. So what to do? How to work his way out of whatever complications he'd brought on himself this time? He sighed, leaning back in the seat and raising an arm to draw his hand over his face once more. Maybe it would be best to just go talk to the cops. He hadn't done anything really wrong after all. Maybe he could talk his way out of it. And if he couldn't, then what? Take off again? Move out of state? Idiot, he muttered at himself and reached to flick on the radio, instantly flooding the vehicle with loud, jangling rock music. Mr. Hero, he said. Dumbass. He drove on into the afternoon. Dan rolled the mouse and watched the cursor zip across the screen to the icon for the virtual form in which to record his experiences of the day's patrol. Another half hour, he told himself, and he could get out of here, maybe get home in time to catch the last quarter of the game on TV. The lieutenant stepped out of his small office, flipping through the manila folder, pausing to scan the pages for snippets and phrases that would provide him with the gist of the many paragraphs of rather unimpressive prose that made up the report. Sinsky, he called over. Yes? On this liquor store assault, what's this about the surveillance camera? Dan sighed. It was glitched. It was what? The image stopped about 2 minutes before the assault. Tape was blank after that. How'd that happen? I haven't a clue. Crappy equipment, maybe. The lieutenant grunted, cast a glance back into the folder. You didn't talk to the last plate? No, sir. Wasn't home. Apartment manager's supposed to call us next time he sees him. Well, you need to go check it out again this morning. Sure thing. I want to put this one to bed quick. Right, Dan responded. Oh, by the way, he added, looking up from the screen, is the DA going to violate the victim? That's up to him. But it's a weapons charge, so I'll bet yes. Total dumbass. He just gets out, and the first thing he manages to do is violate himself. How can people be that stupid? Who knows? But if they weren't, we'd be out of a job. Right, Dan added thoughtfully, returning his gaze to the bright white of the empty form on the screen before him. It was kind of weird, he pondered again. It's like the guy who decked him knew Peter Morales was going to hit the store before he ever stepped inside and got the chance to pull his piece. Did he know somehow? Maybe he knew Morales, knew he'd already done who knows how many more stick-ups. A friend, maybe? Pissed off accomplice? He looked over to where the other man was already turning languidly to re-enter his office. Lieutenant? Yeah. Dan pondered a moment before speaking. The clerk said something funny. At first I thought it was because of his lousy English, but now... The lieutenant turned slowly back. That bit about seeing the perp jump across the room a couple of minutes before it went down? Yeah, only not so much jump. He said it was like he disappeared from one spot and popped up in another. What, you think the clerk was maybe smoking something in the back room? Dan shook his head thoughtfully. No, he wasn't high. Dan turned fully to face his superior. He said the guy was coming up the aisle on the left toward the counter, where the beer was, and he was starting to get up from his stool to meet the guy at the register, and then the guy was just gone. And a second later, he steps around the right aisle to just inside the door, where the drink coolers were. What do you think that was all about? Don't know, the lieutenant responded. Don't much care. Maybe he's a magician. Right, or a ninja. I hear they can do that kind of thing too. The lieutenant folded the report closed. Well, go be enlightened first thing tomorrow, all right? Yes, sir. Should we just bring him in, let one of the gold shields do the questioning? Just find out where he was at that time. If it doesn't feel right, use your own judgment. Yes, sir. The lieutenant turned and stepped back into his office. Dan returned his attention to the still blank form on the screen before him. Finish this one up and get the hell out of here, he told himself. But maybe, sometime tomorrow, swing by the liquor store and get the clerk to clarify what he thinks he saw. Dan was the kind of cop who trusted his instincts, and in this case, as ordinary and unspectacular as the aborted robbery was, something just didn't feel right. In fact, it really felt creepy. And if there was one thing Dan couldn't resist, it was creepy. He lifted his hands, settling his fingers on the keyboard, and glanced down at his notebook. He began to type.